back in a previous episode, we covered 5 crazy planes that you wouldn't believe actually existed. Well, there are so many more where those came from. So here are 5 more strange planes you won't believe existed. Number 1, Bartini Beriev VVA-14. This next Soviet plane was designed with one purpose in mind: to destroy dangerous American nuclear submarines that lurked in the seas around the Soviet Union. But it also had another unique feature. It could also take off from the ground as well as from the water, kind of like a flying hovercraft. The result was one of the most bizarre aircraft ever built, and it might have worked perfectly if not for one major problem. The story began in the dark days of the Cold War. In 1970, the USSR was racing against the US to build better weapons, and they knew that American nuclear submarines could pose a serious threat. So they asked the famous aircraft designer Robert Bartini to come up with a solution. His answer was the VVA-14 flying boat. But it wasn't any ordinary flying boat. It had secret weapons hidden beneath its wings that would be deployed when it spotted a lurking submarine. It could drop depth charges or torpedoes to sink enemy vessels. But how did it take off from the ground? That was possible thanks to its unique design. Its 2 rear fins were actually hollow and could be filled with air to function like balloons. This made it float like a hovercraft above the ground until it reached a high enough altitude to then glide over the surface of the water as a flying boat. But there was a major problem with this amphibious plane. The Soviet government commissioned 40 of these planes, but it turned out that building a new type of aircraft wasn't easy. They struggled to get the engines working correctly, especially the special vertical takeoff engines that were supposed to allow the plane to hover above the ground. And by the time they finally got it right, the Cold War was basically over and the plane was obsolete. In fact, only one prototype ever flew, and that was only after 2 years of testing. All that remained was one empty shell of a second plane, which is preserved today in a museum in Russia. So this plane that was supposed to be a powerful weapon of the Cold War became instead one of the strangest oddities of the era. No. 2. Stipa-Caproni. We all know what a normal propeller looks like on a plane, but this next Italian plane took a very different approach. Instead of having a propeller at the front, this plane put the propeller inside the fuselage itself. The result was one of the ugliest planes ever created, but it was also an experiment in one of the earliest forms of jet propulsion. This aircraft was called the Stipa-Caproni, and it was built in Italy in 1932. It was the brainchild of the engineer Battista. He wanted to see if he could improve on the traditional propeller design by enclosing the blades inside the fuselage of an aircraft. The Stipa was basically a large tube with a propeller inside. And rather than being attached to the engine, the propeller blades were suspended inside the hollow tube and spun by the airflow alone. Basically, it was sucking itself through the air. This was a way of trying to capture the power of jet propulsion, which was still in its infancy at the time. But it didn't work as expected. The plane was very slow and produced very little thrust from its propeller, which was designed to look like a giant cigarette. In fact, it produced more drag than thrust. There was no chance of the plane ever taking flight. Luckily, only one prototype was ever built because the whole idea was eventually scrapped. But although it never flew, it did make an impression. The concept of an enclosed propeller actually did inspire later jet engine designs. As you can see, sometimes even a failure can lead to success in the world of engineering. Number 3, Lockheed XFV-1 Salmon. This next plane was designed to take off straight up in the air like a rocket. That's because it was designed to protect the Navy's valuable ships from incoming attacks. Back in the 1950s, it was feared that the Soviet Union could soon launch devastating attacks from fighter jets that would destroy entire fleets of ships. So the U.S. Navy needed a way to defend itself without having to use long runways to take off. So they turned to the legendary Lockheed Corporation to design a new plane that could take off and land in small areas vertically. The result was the Lockheed XFV-1 Salmon, which could stand up on its tail fin and take off from a small area like a rocket. The plane would then fly out to intercept any enemy planes headed for the fleet and destroy them. This meant that the Navy would not have to rely on radar stations to warn them of an attack, since the plane could literally take off from under their noses. But as cool as it sounds, the plane was extremely hard to fly and even harder to land. Most test pilots said that it was impossible to control and far too dangerous to deploy in actual battle. Only a few test flights were ever conducted before the project was cancelled in 1959. Nobody thought that it was worth risking their lives to operate this plane. And as you can imagine, nobody volunteered for the job. This meant that the Navy would have to find another way to protect its ships from attack. So this strange plane remained as an experimental curiosity and nothing more. Number 4, Snecma Coléoptère. This next French plane was designed to look like a giant flying soda can. Its creators believed that this unique shape would allow it to perform vertical takeoff and landings. But in the end, this bizarre design proved to be too unstable and the project was scrapped after the prototype crashed during testing. This plane was developed in France during the 1950s by a company called Snecma. They believed that the circular design would help the plane rotate in midair and take off vertically. And while that part worked correctly, the plane was extremely unstable in flight. During its final test, the pilot lost control and the plane crashed badly. Although the project was abandoned, the engineers at Snecma weren't discouraged. They continued to study vertical takeoff and landing designs and eventually helped develop new technologies that allowed other planes to soar into the air. So although this particular design was a failure, it did lay the groundwork for future success. And now for number 5, but first, it's shout-out time. Big thanks to our supporters for making these videos possible. Be sure to subscribe if you want to join the family. Number 5, Horten Ho 229. This last plane is perhaps the most famous on the list. That's because it was one of the first stealth planes ever built, but it also has a very dark past. It was created by a German engineering company during the darkest days of World War II. This plane was the Horten Ho 200, and it was designed by two brothers named Reimar and Walter. They were pioneers in the field of aviation, and they wanted to create a plane that would be invisible to radar. At the time, Allied forces were dropping bombs on Germany, and they wanted to find a way to stop the attacks. The Horten brothers believed that a plane with no tail would be less visible to radar, and so they built a prototype, but they ran into several problems. First, the plane was too advanced for the time. its engines were unreliable and difficult to produce in wartime. And second, the war ended before they could finish the plane. In the end, only 2 prototypes were ever built, and both were destroyed by Allied forces before they could ever be used. But this plane was important because it inspired future stealth aircraft like the B-2 Spirit bomber decades later. So, even though it was never finished, it still left a legacy, and that's all we have for you today. Which of these planes was your favorite? Let us know in the comments below. Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that subscribe button for more videos like this. And you can check out our other content by clicking the links on your screen.